Hey there guys, Portal Master here, and welcome to the first episode in my brief history of Toys to Life series. Now, I know that a lot of you guys are Skylanders fans, and I know that some of you aren't necessarily interested in some of these other Toys to Life games, but understand that I'm not going to be doing the same thing that I did with my brief history of Skylanders series, where I dived more into what each game was about. Rather, the purpose of this video series is to take a more analytical look at these games. How did they compete with Skylanders? How did they compete in the Toys to Life market? What was good about them? What could have been improved? And what are the takeaways from the games? That's what this is going to be a little bit more about, and most importantly, I am going to be trying to keep these episodes brief. Now, before we go any further as well, I do need to extend a huge shout out to Seb Skylanders from the Discord, from the Portal Master Discord. He contacted me once I finished the brief history of Skylanders series and offered to lend some of his help with compiling the data that I needed for this series. So I want to send a huge shout out to him for helping me compile the data and take a quick look at some of the numbers that he ran. I'll be including the numbers that he grabbed for me off of the internet in these videos. So let's jump in. Disney Infinity was a competing Toys to Life game that released in 2013 in the fall. It had two subsequent entries, which would be Disney Infinity 2.0 and 3.0, which released in the falls of 2014 and then 2015. Disney Infinity did not attempt to directly compete with Skylanders, contrary to popular belief. Despite the fact that it was also a Toys to Life game, it in and of itself was not the same. As a video game, it was very, very, very different from Skylanders. It took a much less combat-oriented approach and was focused more on the creativity aspects of the game, creating your own levels and exploring the way you wanted to. Various playsets had different playstyles. It wasn't all hack and slash top-down action like in Skylanders, and it did have a lot more emphasis on platforming, and technically was the first platforming Toys to Life game, as it was released prior to Skylanders Swap Force when the jump button was added. So, you know, in a vacuum, Disney did not know that Swap Force was under development and that there were plans to add more platforming action to Skylanders, so you definitely have to say that they did independently develop the platforming, even though the technology in and of itself was more or less a straight knockoff of Skylanders. Unlike Skylanders, there was a lot less emphasis placed on each individual character, and a lot more emphasis was placed on the playsets as a whole. If you've played Skylanders, think of the adventure packs. This was the bread and butter of Disney Infinity sales. By using these playsets, they were able to give you unique experiences and enter you into various game worlds that were unlike all the others. There was a lot less crossplay as well, as not all figures could go into each world, so like you could not take Mike Wazowski into the Pirates of the Caribbean world, but they could play together in the toy box mode, so you were limited more so than in Skylanders, but there was still the freedom to choose which characters within a set you used. At first, Disney Infinity's character selection was a bit limited. Although they did draw from the 100-year history or whatever it is of Disney, it was limited to more classic Disney characters. Although it did include characters from some of the more recent, Disney properties, like it did have Phineas and Ferb and stuff like that, as well as a couple of other characters from more recent Disney properties. But by and large, it drew largely from Disney's classic characters. Later on, as later games happened, you had 2.0, which utilized all of the Marvel characters that Disney had acquired in the past couple of years. It really started to introduce the Avengers and all that stuff, but it also did introduce more classic characters. And then 3.0, which came out in 2015, once again, introduced all of the Star Wars characters. And it did introduce a few more Marvel characters, I believe, and it also introduced more classic characters. Essentially, once 3.0 had come out, all of Disney's major properties had been implemented into Disney Infinity, and their plans were to continue on later with a games as a service model, but we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Overall, the games were pretty well received. There was never really a game that was ever actually poorly received. Some of them were rated better than others. I believe Disney Infinity 3.0 was the lowest rated, but they were all so close. It was a statistical tie, if you ask me. It was all pretty much between 80 or 90% or 8 or 9, whatever you want to say. The worst game that was released for Disney Infinity is more or less the 3DS version of the first game, and that's why it never released on the 3DS again. While the game did not innovate on the technology side, it definitely did innovate in the gameplay side. It is something that I think Skylanders could have taken more from, it really played into the whole sandbox element. And keep in mind, this was 2013 to 2015. This is when Minecraft peaked by all intents and purposes. So essentially, sandbox creation was at its peak. I remember when they announced all of the sandbox modes, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to sell an insane amount. Not just because it's Disney characters, but because it's playing into modern gaming trends. So I think that that's really what helped the game be so good. It never tried to compete with Skylanders on a gameplay perspective. You can say it competed all you want to in terms of like the figures, because it absolutely did. There was not enough room for you know, a ton of different Toys to Life games, no matter how different they were in terms of gameplay. But essentially, it did not try to compete with Skylanders in gameplay, and I think it did innovate the Toys to Life genre, and I think that Skylanders should have used some of the elements that Disney Infinity did, because LEGO Dimensions absolutely did once it was introduced. Unlike Skylanders, which almost always had some type of stocking nightmare, like something was always bad. In every single of the 6 Skylanders games, there was always a rare Skylander, something was always hard to find. That never happened that much with Disney Infinity. There were a few hard to find characters, you know, here and there, but by and large, most of them were pretty easy to get. Of course, you did have the power discs in the original game, which were sold in blind packs, so there is that, and there were intentionally rare characters, but that's not the same thing as, you know, Whamshell being impossible to find for Spyro's Adventure. They're definitely two different things. Another reason that this was less of an issue was because you could directly order characters, which was not something that we saw until I think the Swap Force era, where a store could specifically request a Disney Infinity character and they could then get it in stock. Whereas with Skylanders, if a store was out of, I don't know, say swarms, it couldn't order more swarm characters. It had to wait until another shipment of you know, a box of Skylanders and then take it out. And if you ask me why was it so much easier for Disney Infinity to be stocked than Skylanders, I would say Disney probably had a lot more experience managing supply chains. So they understood how to make sure that everything was always stocked. And that's why it was less of an issue. That simply comes down to Disney had a bunch of experienced toy, you know, manufacturers, people who were very experienced with that, and Activision just didn't have that. So I do want to word this next little bit carefully. I think Disney Infinity appealed to a wider audience. This is not only evidenced because it was such a sandboxy game, but it was also less of a gamer's game. You know, Skylanders, you could, while the system for upgrading wasn't insane, it was definitely more in-depth than I think Disney Infinity was, especially at first. So it felt more like, you know, a light RPG Skylanders did than Disney Infinity. And as a result, Disney Infinity did appeal to a wider audience. You know, RPGs can sort of bog down the average player that just wants to get in and jump on a few platforms and explore like the world of Pirates of the Caribbean. And it also had a lot more wide stream, you know, it appealed to more people because of the brand familiarity, because of the Pirates of the Caribbean, because of Marvel, because of Star Wars. It was able to draw more people into the franchise as a whole. And I think it ultimately appealed more to female, you know, gamers than Skylanders ever did. And I don't want to sound sexist when I say this, but definitely I think the Disney princesses sort of helped to pull in the more casual audience. I mean, it's just a fact that, you know, guys do play more video games than girls do. I'm, again, not trying to stereotype here, but Disney Infinity definitely did more to appeal to the female audience than Skylanders did, and as a result, I think that's part of the reason why it had a wider audience. It definitely, I think, if you really broke it down, would have a much more even gender balance. Getting more into the performance details, when we talk about competition, Disney Infinity only faced more direct competition from Skylanders. While it didn't compete in terms of gameplay, figure sales it definitely did, especially when you consider how expensive it would have been to have collected every Skylander toy and every Disney Infinity toy. I'm sure there were a lot of kids that gave up, I don't know, 10 or 15 Skylanders just to be able to get Disney Infinity instead and a few characters from those playsets. While Amiibo was around during the first or second, I can't remember exactly the timeline, but it was definitely around for the second Disney Infinity game. Again, it was a very indirect competitor to Disney Infinity, especially because I think Nintendo's Amiibo appealed even more to the hardcore gamer, whereas, you know, again, Disney Infinity appealed to the casual audience. LEGO Dimensions did not actually come out until after Disney Infinity 3.0 released, and most of LEGO Dimensions' lifetime sales took place months after release. Like, it didn't sell a ton at first. It took time for it to ramp up. So really and truly, Disney Infinity's greatest competition was always Skylanders. Getting more into the numbers, I'm going to flash an image up there that's going to show you the sales of Skylanders Swap Force versus Disney Infinity, and I pulled my phone out for this section. So you'll notice that Skylanders Swap Force did outsell Disney Infinity, and it actually outsold it by a pretty wide margin. It sold about 20% more than Disney Infinity did, so that's a pretty significant amount. Skylanders outsold Disney Infinity on the Wii and the PlayStation 3, but it sold on a very, very thin margin on the PS3. So really the only console where it blew Disney Infinity out of the water was the Wii. Skylanders Swap Force also did release on next-generation consoles, although even if you took the next-generation consoles out of the equation, Skylanders did still outsell Disney Infinity. Strangely enough, Disney Infinity actually outsold Skylanders on the Wii U. I have no explanation for this, but the margin was so small, I don't really think much of it. It's interesting, though, that the Xbox 360 outsold, Disney Infinity outsold Skylanders on that by such a wide margin. It sold 12.5% more. I don't know why that is. An interesting observation, though. Getting into Trap Team, you'll notice that the margin is definitely thinner for basically everything. Disney Infinity and Trap Team were very close in sales. They were about 400,000 apart, and so Trap Team only sold about 8.5% more than Disney Infinity did. Both games here you'll see did have a drop-off from their predecessor. Trap Team was a bigger drop-off from Swap Force than Disney Infinity 2.0 was from 1.0, which I think is interesting to notice. With the exception of the Wii U, every console that Skylanders Trap Team and Disney Infinity released on, Disney Infinity won. So they won Xbox 360, Xbox One, PS3, and PS4. The only consoles that Trap Team outsold Disney Infinity on was the Wii U by a narrow margin, and then the Wii and the 3DS. And they didn't even bother releasing the game on those two platforms, so it doesn't really matter. And you'll see like an inconsequential amount of PS Vita sales. It's just interesting to note. An interesting thing to take away is that they did outsell Skylanders on Sony consoles. If I had to guess why this is, Disney probably had a wider global influence, and Sony consoles are more present outside of the US than they are inside of the US. So this is probably why it outsold them in other countries, if I had to absolutely guess. Looking at Superchargers, the final direct comparison we can make, Skylanders Superchargers was outsold by Disney Infinity. Disney Infinity won. It was only 100,000 additional copies though, so like 3.5% more. Not a ton. Skylanders did outsell Disney Infinity on the Wii U and Xbox 360, and then they also won the Wii and 3DS again by default because Disney Infinity did not release on those consoles, but Disney Infinity outsold Skylanders on the PS3, the Xbox One, and the PS4. The PS4 by almost double, and again, I suspect that this is due to the global presence of Disney Infinity. So that's basically it for the Disney Infinity sales. I think it's really interesting to compare it to Skylanders, and when we get into LEGO Dimensions, I will sort of start to compare LEGO Dimensions to these other games as well, but LEGO Dimensions came in so late in the game, it's more difficult to draw a direct comparison like I can with Skylanders and Disney Infinity. So this is probably the most numbers-heavy video you'll see in the entire series. I'll try to keep numbers to a minimum going forward. Ultimately, Disney Infinity shut down due to Disney closing its production studio. Disney Infinity didn't stop selling because Toys to Life died or because sales dropped off significantly. In fact, if I had to guess, had a Disney Infinity 4.0 been released, it probably would have cleanly outsold Skylanders Imaginators. It probably would have sold about 2.5 million copies, which would have meant it earned 25% more than Skylanders Imaginators, if I had to purely guess. I don't know if that'd be true. It may have seen a greater drop-off because of Dimensions. It's really quite hard to say, but it definitely could have survived at least to a Disney Infinity 4.0. While a Disney Infinity 4.0 was planned, Disney wanted to switch it over to a games-as-a-service model featuring biannual installments, so every other year. So the next game wouldn't have come out. 4.0 would have come out in 2017 instead of 2016 and featured 2 full years of figure releases before a new game came. This obviously didn't happen because, again, Disney shut down its production studio. I see so many people don't understand that that's what happened. Disney didn't do it because of poor sales. No, they literally just shut it down because they didn't feel like managing it anymore. Playmation or whatever it was also shut down for the same reason. Every single Disney, game stopped being made because of this. It was not a Disney Infinity thing in the slightest. So there you have it. That's basically it for the breakdown of Disney Infinity. It was an insanely successful game franchise. It sold so many copies. Like, it's insane how many it sold. The fact that it was able to compete with Skylanders in such a short period of time is honestly quite impressive. I do wish I could see how many figures it sold compared to Skylanders, because my personal theory is that fewer Disney Infinity figures were sold than Skylanders, simply based on what I would always see in stores, and also if you look at the secondhand market, there's a bigger secondhand market on eBay and at flea markets for Skylanders by a long shot than there is for Disney Infinity. So I don't necessarily know why that would be, but I definitely think it's interesting to think about. So I didn't do a very good job at keeping this video brief, but again, this will probably be the most numbers-heavy video of the entire series. Next week, we're going to talk about LEGO Dimensions, and we're going to take a lot less of a numbers stance on LEGO Dimensions and talk more about how it was able to successfully run the game by doing a games-as-a-service system instead of trying to do annual installments, and why ultimately it was so good it boa constricted itself into its own early death. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that, as well as the remainder of the series of A Brief History of Toys to Life. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been Portal Master. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. Go check out all my social medias linked down in the description below. And that's it. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks again for watching. I just wanted to take some time to thank my generous patrons on Patreon, including APYT Skylanders, Haley, Cinderclash, Adrian, OctoBoom, True Blue Dogemon, and HypnoticOcelot.